All right, we're starting a new unit, cellular respiration. I think you'll see that what you learned in photosynthesis will directly relate to cellular respiration because these two processes kind of depend on each other. So don't get overwhelmed by this, but I just kind of put a listing of some of the weird kind of terms and reactants and products that will be associated with some of these processes. What we're going to want you to be able to do in this chapter is to be able to identify your reactants and products again of 3 different processes: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Okay, all of that deals with the overview of cellular respiration. And so I just want to make note, we're still going to have some of these electron or energy carriers, ATP, we still have that. But now we have NADH instead of NADPH. Remember I told you the pH, a good way to remember that is because that deals with photosynthesis. Now it's just going to be a plain old NADH, and then FADH2. Okay? When they don't have, when they're not carrying those electrons, and we call them electron acceptors, then they're just ADP. They're missing that phosphate, NAD plus and FAD plus 2, I think is what that is, maybe. Okay? So, glycolysis, some of the things you're going to need to know: where it occurs, what are the reactants and products, and same with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So if you ever need to just come back to this page, you'll be able to look at the various things that are associated, reactants and products, where it occurs for each of these processes. So to begin with, you're going to need to know the equation for the overall aerobic cellular respiration process. And when we look at this, we see we're starting out here with C6H12O6. Remember, that is glucose. And 6O2, this is oxygen. That's going to yield 6CO2, carbon dioxide. 6 water, and up to 36 ATP. If we're talking bacteria, sometimes they can get up to 38 ATP. All right? So you'll notice, I hope you notice, that what the plants are using what the plants and animals, any organism that carries on aerobic cellular respiration, what they're using for their reactants, those were the products of photosynthesis. And what they're giving off as their products here in cellular respiration, remember, these were the reactants of photosynthesis. So you can see cellular respiration, photosynthesis, they depend on each other because the products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cell respiration, and the products of cell respiration are the reactants of photosynthesis. So they kind of, depend on each other for these processes. So you will need to know this equation again, just like you did for photosynthesis, because you'll have to know what the reactants are and the products. But we need this process because if you remember when we talked last unit in the last chapter, our cells need energy in this form. If we don't have ATP, we will not survive. We will die. So we have to have this process of cellular respiration in order to make all of this ATP that our cells need to survive. So let's look a little bit at the overview here. The overall process, if we could just sum it up in one sentence, it's cellular respiration releases chemical energy from sugar, remember glucose, to make ATP when oxygen is present. Okay? And so there are different processes involved, and some of them don't involve needing oxygen at that stage. So for example, we start out with glycolysis. Glycolysis always has to occur prior to the actual process of cellular respiration. So this is the step that's anaerobic. Anaerobic means it does not require energy. Okay, no energy. This step is going to occur in the cytoplasm of the cell. And really what glycolysis really means is the splitting of glucose. Lysis means to break apart something, and what we're splitting apart or breaking apart is the glucose. So glucose is broken down into 2-pyruvate, or what we call pyruvic acid, and that's going to eventually go into what we call the Krebs cycle. We get a net total of 2 ATP produced. So we get a little bit of ATP produced, okay? So at this stage, every single organism will carry on this particular step, this glycolysis, where we break that glucose down and we get a little bit of ATP from it to make the 2-pyruvate. Some organisms, like bacteria, if there's no oxygen present, they're going to go into a process called fermentation. We'll get to that towards the end of the chapter. But most organisms are going to carry on what we call aerobic cellular respiration. So the next step with that then is, first of all, when we talk about aerobic cellular respiration here, aerobic means that it requires oxygen. You have to have oxygen present, okay? This process is going to occur in the mitochondria. Remember, we call that the powerhouse of the cell. The reason for that is that it produces ATP. And it produces ATP through this process of cellular respiration. Now, there's 2 main stages here that go with the aerobic part here. We still have to have glycolysis beforehand, so we kind of include that in the overall process of cellular respiration, but these 2 parts are actually the part that are part of the aerobic cellular respiration part. We have the Krebs cycle first. That's going to occur in what we call the matrix of the mitochondria. We're going to show you that in just a minute. It's kind of a inner space there. And this step produces 2 ATP, and it's where we actually break down that pyruvate that you broke the glucose into with glycolysis. We take that, but we'll go into more detail with the Krebs cycle in a little bit. And then it uses coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA, to transport that broken down molecule into the actual Krebs cycle. Then we have the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain occurs in the inner membrane, or cristae, of the mitochondria. So just like we had different parts and structures with the chloroplast for photosynthesis, we're going to have different parts and structures of the mitochondria for cellular respiration. And then this stage right here can produce anywhere from 32 to 34 ATP. Again, this is our goal. This is our goal right here, is to make that ATP. So you can see most of your electrons get produced in this, most of your ATP gets produced during this electron transport chain. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on. Okay, so let's look at the structure here of the mitochondria. Here, your mitochondria is kind of this oval-shaped object. And remember, this would be like the cytoplasm out here surrounding it, because these are just floating around in the cell, in the cytoplasm. It has this inner membrane, and these very inner folds here are the cristae, or the inner membrane. It has an outer membrane, and then here, this liquidy structure right here, all this in here, that is the matrix, okay? So again, the Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix, in that liquidy part. The electron transport chain occurs in the inner membrane, which makes sense, right? Because those electron transport chains have to be embedded in a membrane. Remember, for photosynthesis, they were embedded in the thylakoid membrane. So they need a membrane to hook onto in order to function. So that hopefully will help you remember that a little bit. Okay, so let's do a little bit of practice here and thinking about seeing if you can label these parts without and identify where the different stages occur. We'll see if you can do it without peeking in your book. We have this, first of all, we have the cytoplasm out here, remember? Do you remember which process occurs in the cytoplasm? Glycolysis. Okay, So glycolysis occurs out in the cytoplasm. This is the outer membrane. This whole structure here is the mitochondria. Okay. In here we have the inner membrane. And then that liquidy part that's inside, that's kind of enclosed within the inner membrane there, is called the matrix. And the matrix is where the Krebs cycle occurs. And the inner membrane is where the electron transport chain occurs. Okay? Because again, you need to have electron transport chain has to be embedded in a membrane. So that makes sense that that's where you would find that, is in that inner membrane. Okay?